very right to be human is denied every day to hundreds of millions of people.
Dans ce temple des Nations Unies, nous sommes les gardiens d'un idéal. Nous sommes les gardiens d'une conscience. La lourde responsabilité et l'immense honneur qui sont les nôtres doivent nous conduire à donner la priorité au désarmement dans la paix.
We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop.
Chaque génération, sans doute, se croit vouée à refaire le monde. La mienne sait pourtant qu'elle ne le refera pas. Mais sa tâche est peut-être plus grande. Elle consiste à empêcher que le monde se défasse.
So I have the pleasure and honor to introduce our guest today, Professor Amitav Acharya, but I'm sure that all international relations academics and students know or should know him. Amitav Acharya is UNESCO Chair in Transnational Challenges and Governance and Distinguished Professor of International Relations at the American University in Washington. He is the first non-Western scholar to be elected as the president of the International Studies Association 6 years ago, the largest and the most influential global network in international studies. For the anecdote, it is there that I met him. Professor, I was the academic, the shy academic in the book exhibition in San Francisco who asked you to sign the book, The Making of Global International Relations, that I just have bought. And today I will be very happy to meet you again during next ISA Congress in Nashville. Professor Amitav Acharya is really a global academic. Previously, he was a professor at York University, Toronto, and University of Bristol. He was the inaugural Nelson Mandela Visiting Professorship in International Relations at Rhodes University in South Africa, the inaugural Boeing Company Chair in International Relations at the Schwarzman Scholars Program at Tsinghua University, Fellow of Harvard's Asia Center and John Fitzgerald Kennedy School of Government, and Christensen Fellow at Oxford. He has received 2 distinguished Scholar Awards from the International Studies Association, one in 2015 from its Global South Caucus for his, I quote, contribution to non-Western international theory and inclusion in international studies, and another 2 years ago from ISA's International Organization section that recognized, I quote again, scholar of exceptional merit whose influence, intellectual works, and mentorship will likely continue to impact the field of years to come. And finally, last year, he received American University's highest honor, Scholar Teacher of the Year Award. Professor, we are very happy, incredibly happy to have you today for this final lecture, and I give you the floor.
Thank you. I am very flattered by what you just said. I'm not sure I will live up to that expectation, but thank you, Sonia, in particular, for being persistent in keeping me engaged with the process. I must say that I'm a little sad that I couldn't be there in person. The last overseas trip I made before the pandemic was to Paris to give a speech at the Paris Peace Forum. Which was absolutely wonderful. And I could not wait to get back. So I was just kind of hoping that this will be the opportunity. So my last trip was to Paris, and the first trip in the pandemic age will be also to Paris and of course to Lille. But unfortunately that didn't happen. So I really thoroughly enjoy every time I go to France. And in fact, one of the earliest versions of this idea of global IR was actually given at Sciences Po and the School of International Studies they have there. And over the years, I have tremendously benefited from interacting with the French colleagues. Now, European colleagues in general, but there is a reason for that. International relations is very much, in a sense, an Anglo-American field, the field. So I mean, I have a lot of friends in Britain, I taught in Britain. I was a British professor, and of course, I'm a US professor now. But the appetite for alternative ideas is very small there. I mean, because they're dominant. I mean, if you are already dominant, why you bother accepting alternative ideas? It's very human to feel like that. And I've seen that as a president of the International Studies Association, that it is very hard to impress an audience who are so deeply socialized in a traditional way of thinking and doing so well with that. So why should they bother? And also they have kind of a hegemony when it comes to training younger generation of scholars, not only in the West, but also in the rest. A lot of people get their PhDs in Britain and United States. But when you come to France, it's quite different. And I must say also in other parts of Europe, but particularly France, there is a tendency, there is a spirit to take in new ideas, encourage new ideas, and promote new ideas. So which is why I feel like much more intellectually at home in France, and also I should say Germany and Italy as well, because there is this idea, because they were not the dominant players in creating this field. I'm not talking about international relations in practice. Of course, every civilization contributed to that. But the field of IR, which is extremely narrow and very Anglo-American, British in origin, American in evolution, basically. So this is why it is my pleasure to actually appear before this meeting and this gathering, which I assume has a very global audience. But it is really good that you are doing this and you have chosen this theme. So that's my kind of way of a general introduction, but I will be going into the topic now. If you give me a few seconds, I will use some PowerPoints, which will be useful for me as well as for you, because it's hard to focus without PowerPoints. Okay, it should come up. Okay. Right. So can you see it now? Yeah, should be okay. So international relations beyond West and the rest. So I like to use images when I speak, give public or even in the class. And I would like to start with a few images, which are very powerful and very helpful to me in developing this theme over the years. By the way, those of you who are on social media can follow me on Twitter. Okay, so moving on. So I'm using a new computer. Sometimes it doesn't change as well as I do. Okay. Okay. Right. This clear now? Okay. So when, okay. When you talk about West and the rest, in the traditional way, this is what comes to your mind, isn't it? This is a book, best-selling book by Neil Ferguson, whom I actually know very well. And we spent some time in China together teaching the same course at Tsinghua University. And I consider himself to be a good friend of mine. He, in fact, has written a blurb for my book. But we disagree on how to explain the West and the rest phenomenon. So this image is very typical because it has the subtitle West and the Rest. So that's what you're talking about. And of course, there is the man who is standing tall above everything is not from the rest, not an Asian or African or a Chinese or a Muslim, but a typical white, I guess maybe Englishman standing in the 19th century, 18th century period. And that's the imagery of the West presented in international relations in the West, because that's international relations started in the West as a discipline, not in the reality of studying international affairs, but the field of study, the discipline called international relations is basically a Western dominated field. And this is the imagery you have. And when I became the president of International Studies Association, I used this image on the right. This was the presidential seal, so to speak, with a banyan with multiple roots over the globe. In a sense, when Neil is talking about West and the rest, he's talking about West versus the rest. When I talk about West and the rest, I talk about West with the rest. And that basically gives you where I'm coming from, a sense of where I'm coming from. So I will then continue I'll try to cover my speech today in 3 parts. The first one is, what is global IR? Now, the idea of global international relations has already been mentioned already, so I don't have to tell you the word itself. But global international relations is my way of bridging the West and the rest, or going beyond the West versus the rest divide. That's like my signature, my code word. How do you overcome this divide? And rather than perpetuate it. I'm not here to perpetuate the divide. In fact, global IR is different from some other types of theories like post-colonialism, which, they like, and for good reason, to maintain the distinctiveness of an, post-colonial or decolonial perspective. And so as to juxtapose it against the Western perspective. Now, I can understand that and I sympathize with that, but my goal is to bridge the divide rather than to keep highlighting the divide, even though that divide is very important and it's not going to go away anytime soon. So this is how it all started. When I was president of International Studies Association, just becoming, I gave the speech, and this was pretty much the first slide when I was giving my presidential address. So it has global IR and regional worlds, and it was given in Toronto at the ISA convention, but the subtitle was a new agenda for international studies. And even though this thing in the middle did not stay in the article that got published, but this image was there. This is another way of understanding global IR, and also the West versus the rest divide. So hence the subtitle, Beyond Sahibs and Munshis. Now, Sahib is an Englishman or a European gentleman who has come to India to become part of initially the British East India Company, to work for the company, to rule India, and later on, of course, the British government, which took over the governance of India from the British East India Company in the 1850s. So this was a college that was set up by the British in what is called Kolkata now, or it used to be Calcutta, the seat of the British Empire, to train British civil servants coming into India in knowledge about India, about Asia, about the Orient. And so you can see that the prospective civil servant are already appointed by the company sitting there. But the teacher is a munshi. He is what we in India people call Parsi. So a Muslim, traditional Muslim teacher. And Parsi, a munshi can be usually a Parsi, people originally from Persia, today's Iran, but who migrated to India. And they were very knowledgeable in language, culture, and tradition of the East, including India. So they were naturally hired to teach in this school, to train British civil servants. However, even though the teacher is an Indian, they got paid a fraction of what the European teachers in the same college were being paid. And also, when it comes to running the school, it was all done by the Sahibs, or the white British or European gentlemen who were there. So the inequality is very striking. In terms of knowledge, of course, the munshis were more knowledgeable. But in terms of power, it was the power to run the place, decide what to be taught and what is not to be taught. It was the sahibs. It was the white men, so to speak. So international relations to me has actually evolved in the same way, kind of a divide between the West and the rest. Even though a lot of the knowledge, ideas, and concepts actually lay in the non-West, in this case, East, but all over the world. But when it comes to presenting, organizing that knowledge, when it came to deciding what should be taught and what should not be taught, that decision rests with the West. And in a racial way too. It's West, the white people decided what not only the Black people should read, but also our brown people should read, so to speak, but also how the entire sort of curriculum should be designed. And international relations has been like that since its birth. It was, in a sense, created in Britain. Some people trace it to 1919 with the creation of a chair at the University of Wales in Aberystwyth, or now called Aberystwyth University. And so it was born in UK, but then it migrated to US, and US became the dominant player in international relations. And it is between those two powers and their institutions and their intellectuals that the field has been defined, delimited, and it is their textbooks, training centers, universities, think tanks that have shaped what is taught or researched in international relations, even though their knowledge claim is weaker than those of the rest of the world. So the rest of the world actually knows as much, if not more, about, at least about their own regions. But their voices never got in to how international relations was taught and pursued in the West, but also because of the dominant position of the West in the world, throughout the world. So that was my way of impressing on my audience that the challenge that we face in globalizing international relations. Globalizing to me simply means being more inclusive, but it has other dimensions I'll be speaking in a moment, but trying to bridge this gap and remove this, overcome this injustice, which I call epistemic injustice, where the knowledge claim lies with the entire humanity and also the non-Western countries being big part of it, our societies being part of it, but the production of knowledge is done mostly in the West and imposed on the rest. Okay. How do we overcome that? So I have done, you have seen some of my work. Thank you for advertising some of my books. But I collaborated with Professor Buzan, Barry Buzan, early on, even though I started thinking about it a bit earlier, but to get this ideas across, Barry Buzan and I have a long and productive partnership going back to 20 years now. And so we started with this idea of a non-Western IR theory, or a non-Western international relations theory. It's a collection of essays which focused mostly on Asia. Then more recently, we have been working independently as well. Recently, we did this book in 2019, The Making of Global International Relations. Now, here you can see we are not using non-Western IR theory anymore. We are using global international relations. So this was done in 2010, based on meetings that we had since 2005. But this was in 2019. 2019 is the 100th anniversary of the founding of that chair of international politics that many people think started the field of international relations. So we did this book, and more recently, just about to come out, is a book called Reimagining International Relations, looking at the contributions from China, Islam, and India. So it's kind of a prequel going backwards, because this book in the middle really covered the modern period. So it did not go back to the history of civilizations before the rise of the West. The book on the right, much shorter, is actually goes back. So it's a prequel, not a sequel, but a prequel to these books in the left. And it looks at the origins of some of the ideas that we study in international relations, like power, authority, governance, cooperation, peace, and rationality that we study, norms, how they can be found in multiple civilizations, but in this case, 3 of them, India, China, Islam, and we're hoping that other people will be working on similar ways in other regions of the world. So the reason why we moved from non-Western IR theory to global IR is because, again, the idea is not to perpetuate West versus the rest. And so we, the book on the left, non-Western, Western, non-Western, it did its purpose. It sensitized people to, the Western dominance of the discipline. It got wide recognition for its call to bring in non-Western ideas and practices into international relations. But then it served its purpose. Continuing with that would have prolonged this divide, in my view. So I actually pushed very hard for global international relations, which actually bridges the West versus the rest. And that was kind of the sum of key of my 24 presidential speech. The idea of the global IR is to transcend, not perpetuate, but transcend the West versus the rest divide. So that's a bit of history. Moving on then, I will elaborate a little bit on what I just said in terms of how traditional IR evolved and how global IR differs from it. This is very familiar story, especially to those who are familiar with international relations. I do understand that some of you may not be students of international relations or international law, but you would have a general sense. So we start with, again, I repeat what I said earlier, the traditional narrative of IR is that as a field of study, IR began in the UK, but really developed in the USA. So you can actually say born in UK, grown in USA. But some Americans don't even acknowledge the British origins of international relations. And that gets the British very angry, very, very pissed off, so to speak. So Stanley Hoffman, Hoffman should be 2 N's. He said, he called international relations an American social science, born and raised in the US. That's not true, actually. International relations was born in UK, but raised in the US for sure. Anyway, I don't want to get into this narrow debate among British and American, between British and American scholars on this, but it is an Anglo-American field in many ways, at least as a field of study. And then when you go back in history, when international relations scholars in the Anglo-American tradition go back in history, they go back only to Greece and Rome, ancient Greece and Rome. So there's kind of a narrative that says all those big ideas about politics, international relations started in ancient Greece or ancient Rome. And the West basically inherits this. The West, particularly Western Europe and the West in general, including the United States, basically inherited those ideas. So it's kind of a Greece and Rome are the progenitors, wellsprings of the ideas about politics and international relations, whether it's democracy or norms or balance of power or power politics. Everything started in diplomacy, or everything started there. And the West is the successor to that civilization. And therefore, the West inherited and developed it and passed it to the rest of the world. Now, this is as important as Eurocentrism. When you talk about Eurocentrism, we somehow think it's Europe. But actually, Greco-Romanocentrism is a precursor to Eurocentrism. It is actually the original source of Eurocentrism. And this is kind of ironic, because if you look at very carefully, the Greeks never thought of themselves as particularly European. The Greeks, at the height of their civilization, were equally dismissive of Europe, which is Northern Europe, and the East. They thought only Greece is a distinctive civilization, which was sort of everybody is ethnocentric. So Greeks were, we are better than either the Europeans or the Asians or the Africans. And the Romans also, they were not particularly European either, despite being located in Southern Europe. So they also considered Northern Europeans barbarians, just like they considered Africans and Asians barbarians. So in fact, one can argue that the Romans might have had more respect for the Asians. Asia, by the way, was a province of the Roman Empire. And Romans got a bloody nose every time they tried to attack Parthia, for example, well, most of the time. So they actually had more respect for Asians than Northern Europeans. I'm putting it very bluntly and being provocative. So neither of these two civilizations are actually European in a strict sense of the term. But they became the source, progenitors or wellsprings of European ideas. And this happened only after Renaissance, but particularly after the Enlightenment. The idea of Europe, Asia was there in geographic sense, but in a cultural sense, in a civilizational sense, it's very problematic to make this division between where Europe, where is Asia, and also the idea of the East and the West, also very modern. We can talk about how the idea of the West originated. I mean, part of it had to do with the fact that the Roman Empire was divided into Western, where after the fall of Rome, Roman Empire moves to Constantinople, present Istanbul. And even before that, the Romans were talking about the eastern part of the empire and the western part of the empire. And after the fall of Rome, 5th century AD, so it becomes kind of more institutionalized. That's one source. But really, again, very hard. I mean, that was basically a division within the Roman Empire, not between the Roman Empire and the rest of the world. And ironically, by the way, if you look at the origins of the term Europe, it actually, mythologically at least, and myths are not totally unimportant, Europe was named after an Asian princess, Europa. And Asia was named by an European empire, Greeks or European civilization, Greeks and the Romans. As I said, Asia was a province of the Roman Empire. So this distinction between Asia and Europe, West and the East, is a very modern construct, very artificial construct. It had no meaning beyond a geographic and limited geographic sense. But then with the Renaissance and Enlightenment, it became really institutionalized and a very sort of dominant way of classifying cultures and civilizations. So the West acquired if you have read Edward Said or John Hobson more recently, professor at Sheffield University, they talk about how these terms become racialized and how the distinctions are made between the rational, scientific, progressive, masculine West and the superstitious, backward and feminine and unscientific East. And you can talk about East as the rest. So this stereotyping is actually quite recent. So if you actually start studying international relations with a bit of history, it makes it easier for you to go back and try to bridge this gap because, again, this is an artificially constructed distinction. That is not to say there were no differences, but the differences were as normal as you will find in human society and at any age. But this institutionalized distinction between West and the rest, or West and the East, is very much of a product of modernity that was driven, constructed by Western Europe and a little later the United States. So moving on then, the rise of the West and international relations takes its cue from that kind of historical narrative. And it does draw a lot of its ideas of politics and international relations from Greece and Rome, and then brings it to a larger European context. But then when it comes to the international system and world order, it really puts Westphalia, the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, at the center. as if everything started. When it comes to world order, international relations, everything started from there. And the pre-Westphalian systems are pretty much ignored or given that because they're not part of modernity. Westphalia is the beginning of modernity. Now, if you look at Henry Kissinger's book, I have it somewhere in my desk with a copy signed by him. But go back and take a look at Henry Kissinger's World Order. One of the most popular books, probably the best-selling books on world order. The first two chapters are actually Westphalia and Concept of Europe. They're on modern Europe. The first two chapters. So that is the blueprint. That is the ideal type of international relations and world order, especially a world order that seeks to preserve stability in a successful way. Then he moves to Islam, then he moves to Asia, India, China, Japan, only after starting with Europe. So, and in the chapter on Islam is actually titled, one of the two chapters, A World in Disorder. So Islam has no way of building order as if. I'm sort of, again, but it is there. It's a way of how IR is represented, world order thinking is represented. The Europe built the world order with Westphalia and Concept of Europe in 1815 after the defeat of Napoleon. The rest of the world is basically following the model, and the rest of the world, he does pay attention to history, but he considers that history, the Chinese, Indian, Japanese, or Islamic history as kind of deviations from the norm, from the model, and sometimes leads to disorder, even when he gives some credit to the Chinese, in particular for building their own version of world order, but it is seen as an aberration. That's not normal. So he kind of reverses history. Europe comes first, and the earlier, historically earlier civilizations like Islam, China, and certainly China and India, they come later. And then everything ends up with an American synthesis, where Woodrow Wilson is called the conscience of the world. The same Woodrow Wilson who is now confirmed as a racist, leading to Princeton University to remove his name from the Woodrow Wilson School of International and Public Affairs. So this is a book published in 2014. Go back and take a look. You will see what I'm talking about. But that's the narrative. Again, Kissinger is both a scholar and a policymaker. Of course, he's more well-known these days as a statesman in the world, but his work is read by millions, even just because he's Kissinger. And that's the kind of narrative that gets into the minds of people. I actually use that as a textbook just to point out, starting with the table of contents to my students, that how it kind of distorts reality. But to go back then, Westphalia becomes the origins. Now, there is some justification for it because Westphalia did create a particular type of international order based on the model of anarchy. A bunch of independent states, or later become nation states, which manage the relationship, not because of any hegemony of the Pope or the Holy Roman Empire, but simply through interactions, through balancing of power and concerting. When that happened in the 1815 concert of power. So you have balance of power and concert of power as the mechanisms, and then the international system is anarchic, meaning there is no hegemon, no superior authority, either secular or religious, above the state. And to some extent, those ideas spread. And today, if you look at international relations, you will see Westphalia's signature very, very strong all over the world. However, there are also a lot of problems here because the Westphalian model is not the only model. Now, to put it very simply, if you study sort of interstate relations, let's forget about international relations, because international talks about nationalism and nation state, but interstate relations, it's as old as history itself, started from the Sumerians and the Egyptians. Now, that was 5,000 years ago. But Westphalia has been with us since 500, or less than 500 years ago. So So do you want to study international relations looking at 500 years or 5,000 years? Now, the vast majority of the people do not belong to Europe in this world. They belong to other civilizations. Now, that means what about their models, their ideas of statecraft, their ideas of organizing world order? Should you either ignore them or consider them as aberrations or deviants, like Kissinger does? Or should you try to construct a narrative that looks at the multiple global foundations of international relations? So that is pretty much my argument in Global IR. I am not saying Westphalia is not important, although we sometimes miss out its dark sides. The dark side of Westphalia was that it created peace in Europe, relative peace, and then allowed Europeans to go out and conquer the rest of colonize the rest of the world. Some very interesting work coming out of Germany now focuses on that Westphalia actually contributed to imperialism because you maintain peace in Europe, relative peace, of course, not like before 1648, the 30-year war, or no, that's different types of conflicts. It stabilized Europe, and then it created communication and interaction among European states, and that allowed the Europeans to go out and conquer the New World and Asia and Africa and the like. And there is an argument, and that sort of argument doesn't feature in the traditional accounts of Westphalia, including Kissinger. But beyond that, Westphalia does matter, but it is not, it's only a 400-500 year history. And even that history in Westphalia, Europe never was really Westphalian until the 19th century. Big empires remained, hegemony of powers remained. The European powers like Britain, France, Germany, Prussia, they did have their own hold over small countries, their own hegemony over small countries like Poland, for example. So Europe was never really a level playing field, even after Westphalia. But generally it created a model, and that model is very influential. But that model never really had a perfect fit for the rest of the world, which had a very different tradition of organizing world order, like the Chinese-led tributary system in East Asia was very un-Westphalian. And just because Westphalia got imposed by colonial powers in the rest of the world doesn't mean that pre-existing forms of international or a global world ordering, so to speak, disappeared. And they always remained beneath the surface, and now they are coming back. As the relative power of the West declines, these pre-existing models or ideas and institutions of statecraft, diplomacy, international relations comes back. Now, so the argument then, the narrative is that Westphalia expanded to the rest of the world because Europe took over the rest of the world. And then when Europe left, it kind of created nation states and therefore regional and international systems based on the Westphalian model. And the United States basically remained committed to that model. A lot of people say United States created its own world order, different from Europe. But actually, if you look at it closely, there is more continuity than change. The traditional narrative is that Europe managed international or world order through balancing of power and imperialism. Two ways: balance of power in Europe, imperialism in the rest of the world. United States is supposed to have created collective security through the UN and also supposed to be not imperial. So unlike Europe, United States did not practice imperialism. But that traditional narrative, you look at it very closely, is very problematic. It's not really very true. The United States did continue to practice balance of power in a slightly different way because of different contexts. But the Cold War was basically commitment to balance of power politics. The United States did have empires and its own empire. It ruled over Philippines for a while. Then, of course, different stages, Cuba and Haiti, and then Hawaii and Guam are still part of the United States. So, but I also, in a new book that I'm writing now and trying to finish on the origins of world order, my argument is that the American world order started at home. It was not, as people say, it's after 1945 that the United States becoming number one power, creating the UN. The US led or American idea of world order. And by world order, I mean not just global order, but a world order that when a civilization or a powerful country tries to create and impose its norms and values on other people, which are not part of the same civilization, and kind of observes them, forces them to accept those norms, otherwise marginalizes them. Now that started in the United States as soon as the settlers arrived in the 17th century, early 17th century. Maybe you can start by even 16th century, as soon as the Europeans arrived in the so-called New World. But the United States certainly built that kind of world order at home against the American native Indians. So manifest destiny, westward expansion, imposing its own standard of property rights, thanks to people like John Locke, who drafted the Constitution of Carolinas, and implementing it through subjugation and expulsion of the Indians to reservations, and then bringing in slaves from Africa to build its powerful economy. So American world order started then. And I don't see really that big a disjuncture between what the American state and what the European state. You can say there are superficial differences to the UN system and not imperialism in the grand scale as Europe did, but the idea of building a hegemony, imposing your values and institutions on others started at home in the United States. And of course, the West of the United States was not home at that time. It was frontier country. There were still very powerful native Indian forces until the 19th century, until the late 19th century. So the United States to fight that, but ultimately prevailed and built its world order. And the liberal order, despite this grand sounding name, inherited a lot of these characteristics, including hegemony, racism, and kind of not imperialism as in the formal sense, but an imperial mindset. So a lot of Americans know that. They write about American empire, America as the new Rome, and that idea that we are number one country in the world and that we are the role bearer. We are a city and a shining hill, and we are exceptional. All this comes out of that. All right. So U.S. dominance, in a sense, did not really displace Westphalia. In fact, the U.S. remains committed to Westphalia. It's a very sovereign, conscious state. Despite saying all these things about UN and collective security, when it comes to American homeland, it is as sovereign conscious as any. Actually, the European Union is much less sovereign conscious, sovereignty conscious. And in that process, the history, culture, and ideas of the rest are either relegated, marginalized, or considered as deviants and not normal. That has been the international relations traditionally. There are variations in this, but this is the international relations I was trained in. And that's what is reflected directly or implicitly in the textbooks that we have at least in the English language that I know of. What about the arguments of global IR? It's kind of the opposite. The substance of the field of IR was invented in Britain and the US, like Department of International Relations or International Politics. The first known department with that name, University of Wales, we don't mind that. And then all the institutions started in Britain and the United States about the same time, 1920s and 30s. And then the United States takes over kind of the field. But what about the substance of international relations? When you look at international relations, you look at not just the institution, the field, but you look at what we study, not how, in what department we study, what textbook we use. That's one thing, but I think you have to look at the substance. What are the themes and concepts and ideas we draw on? Now, that substance was not invented in Europe or the West. In fact, it was not invented in any particular place, nor did it begin with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. That substance is global and historical, right from the beginning, the dawn of human civilization that we know of. And other regions and civilizations, and I'm giving 3 examples, but you'll find my new book I'm working on world order, origins of world order, you'll find dealing with Africa, dealing with the pre-Columbian Americas, and the like. Every civilization had its own worldview, old ideas, and some have had different from each other, but surprisingly, there is a surprising degree of convergence. So convergence, not because one civilization simply got it from another civilization, but they are also independently developed. We are all human beings, by the way. So we are different in the way we eat our food or the kind of food we eat, maybe the way that we look, but that doesn't make us any less human. One doesn't make one human person being sort of any less of a human person than others. So the idea here is just like the idea of human rights. You have human rights just by being human, no matter where you come from, what cultural background you come from. Similarly, human society has certain basic similarities, and that similarity is reflected in the way the ideas and institutions of international relations evolved. There are, of course, differences, but we should not be accentuating the differences and forgetting the commonalities. So when you talk about the role of other regions and civilizations, think of those. They developed their own ideas. Some of them are different. Some of them are similar to what happened developed in Europe, but they were independently developed. And then some of them were evolved through diffusion, like when the Europeans went overseas and created their nation states or left their empires with nation states and kind of diffused the Westphalian model. All these three things are important. So independent creation, parallel creation, diffusion, they're all important. International relations, however, as a field has been talking only about diffusion and diffusion from west to the rest rather than from rest to the west. That is absolutely not true. This is not supported by evidence. So as I said, looking at 5,000 years of civilizational history to look at the origins of world order, I am convinced more than ever. I'll show you some examples of how you can actually apply it to modern ideas of diplomacy and even international law. Okay, I will talk about it later. So therefore, international relations is best understood as the product of interactions and mutual learning between all civilizations and states, even though some have been more powerful than others at different stages of history. So if you bring in different civilizations or societies, you'll find that the West has been, so this is also very interesting. There's a coincidence between the emergence of the IR as a field and the rise of the West. So in the early 20th century, when IR was created in, say, Europe, Europe was still very dominant, although this was just the year the First World War ended. But it was still very much a world dominated by the West, Europe and the United States. The United States was emerging as the global hegemon about to replace the Great Britain. And that field of international relations reflected the realities of not only the early 20th century, but the 19th century and the 18th century. So the rise of the West and the dominance of the West and the emergence of international relations as a field coincided as a field. So, but if you look at international relations within course as a product of 5,000 years of history, the rise of the West is a very small blip in that long duration of history, or longue durée, as Brodel will put it. So that history will tell you that there are many civilizations that have come and gone, and they were dominant. I mean, Rome was dominant for a while. China was dominant for a while, for a very long time. India, at one point, the largest economy in the world. Of course, in their own respective regions, we have very powerful empires. So when you talk about world order, and here I agree with Kissinger, you're not talking about global order. You're talking about world order, how a nation or a civilization or a region imagines itself as the center of the world. Every civilization is centered on itself. Every civilization has a concept of universalism, based on its own ideas and approaches, which it thinks is applicable to the rest of the world. The Europeans had this, the Chinese had it, the Indians had it, the Islam rulers had it, so did the Incas and the Egyptians. So if you look at civilization and world order in that sense, which is the only realistic way of looking at it, you'll find that every civilization has contributed ideas and institutions, some of them independent of each other, some of them in tandem with each other through diffusion. Some of them actually, in a sense, imposed on them by others. And if you therefore look at international relations from a long time span, you'll find that it is indeed the case that the substance of IR was not invented in the West. It was invented globally. International relations has multiple global origins. And that's why we call it global IR. So what is global IR then? It is challenging. It places non-Western societies as makers and givers of world order and turns Western-dominated IR upside down. Now, this is not to say West did not do anything, but there is so much credit given to the West that I put it this way, that the contribution of non-Western societies has to be center stage because, again, in the long 5,000 years of history, it has been immense. And one can argue how immense, whether it has matched or even exceeded the influence of the West. But a good argument can be made that in certain areas of IR, the contribution of the non-Western societies is even greater than that of the West. And the West actually learned a bit of its ideas from the non-West. But that's going deeper into it, but I'll give you some examples of this. And global IR is inclusive. It redefines and broadens the discipline of international relations by recognizing the histories, ideas, practices, and contributions of societies and actors that have been neglected and marginalized in the existing IR literature. That includes non-Western countries, but also includes sections within the current West. For example, I already told you, the native Indian societies, sort of so-called American Indian societies in North America, and also the civilizations in the South America that existed before the Columbian disruption, so to speak, Christopher Columbus, the so-called discovery of the New World. And I'll go into it a little more detail, but I want to say, what is the rationale for a global IR? Now, I don't want to sound like it's all about being inclusive and being nice and just. That is true, but that's only giving you a small part of what global IR is. It is not about being inclusive or promoting epistemic fairness and justice. That's the marginalized groups, bring them in. Okay, so it's kind of a moral normative issue. It is part of this. All IR theories are normative. They try to do something that they think is right. But global IR is also scientific and also policy oriented in some ways. It can lead to more policy efficacy. Now, why is it scientific? Well, it gives theories more explanatory power. If you develop theories from one region, like Europe, and international relations is a very regional science in that sense, European or American. It is in some of my discourses on this that I have called international relations as kind of European area studies or American area studies without denigrating area studies. So we can have international relations from other parts of the world. So if you derive a theory from one part of the world and apply it to the other part, you'll find that often it doesn't work, it doesn't fit. So if you develop a theory from a whole range of places and contexts and histories, you'll find that that has more explanatory power. And that is very true of IR theories, realism, liberalism, constructivism. I'm going to give you one example of that you would in Europe appreciate, regional integration theory, what is called neo-functionalism, and very powerful theory of the late 50s, 60s that explained regional integration. It was not called European integration. Now it was called regional integration theory, as if it applies to all over the world. Now, that was derived from Europe, Western Europe's experience after World War II, the idea of, those of you who have taught this would know spillover and how the European coal and steel community becomes the European economic community, and then European community, and then European Union, and charting the pathway, and seeing that as a model. But that sort of a model was based on certain domestic and regional conditions, like you have to have pressure groups and a pluralistic kind of a society, a certain amount of resources. So the work of people like Ernest Haas, for example, and others, was based on certain assumptions about what the society and the material conditions would be for European integration to work. But until recently, a lot of scholars from Europe try to, or even the United States, try to say, this is the model of European integration. This is the model of, this is what trust creates. This is how we understand why integration occurs or doesn't occur. And the European Union spent millions and millions of dollars promoting its model in Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world. But in most cases, it was failure. And as you might have seen the Oxford Handbook of Comparative Regionalism, I have a chapter in this. It's like regionalism beyond EU centrism, but even the book itself by Thomas Risse and Tanya Bogle and other, they all admit that the European model has not worked in other parts of the world, in most cases. In some cases, they do, but in most cases. Why? Because it was based on one set of conditions in one continent or subcontinent, so to speak, Western Europe, and thought to be universal. So that's the kind of world order building, that you derive your own model based on your own ideas and conditions, but you think that's universal. Now, I'm not saying this is typical to the Europeans. It's typical to all civilizations. But the Europeans had the power, had the resources, at least until recently, to create that model and diffuse it, so to speak, if not impose it, and didn't work. So here the issue, moral of the story is not inclusive, non-inclusive. It's a simply question of whether it is scientific to derive theories and models from one part of the world and apply to others, or expect it to explain everything. It's also policy relevant because the European Union, I think, would have saved a lot of money if it had not tried to promote that kind of a model. And now they have realized it. I have participated in many European Union funded programs, and I've seen this transition over the last 20 years. Finally, comparative regionalism replaced regional integration theory, so to speak. And that is true of other areas too. In realism, we'll find the idea of national security developed in the United States after World War II, that security meant protecting your territory and sovereignty from external military threats. Security was military security. Now, that may have worked for Europe during the Cold War. Doesn't work for anywhere these days, but during the Cold War, maybe it worked for Europe or United States. But for the rest of the world, the major conflicts or the sources of conflict were not military, but non-military. They're not external threats, but they were internal threats. So the idea of national security, which the United States tried to implement and impose, did not work. So, through its interventions and peace building and the like, it did not work. You'll find that security meant something very different in different places, especially in the non-Western world. Security was more human security rather than national security. Again, we're waking up to it now, but after lots of deaths and a lot of wasted resources from Afghanistan today, but going back to Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s. Similarly, we have same kind of debate about liberal international order. The liberal international order is based on a set of ideas from Western Europe and the United States in the early 20th century. Now, is that order really good for the rest of the world? Does it really reflect the conditions of the rest of the world? So it is not the normative question, and people have criticized the liberal order on normative grounds. I have done that. But it's also a scientific question. Is this a role model? Is this a model for the world that actually produces order, inclusivity, development? Well, the jury is very much out. It has some good things, good outcomes, but it also has a lot of negative outcomes. And it was never really an inclusive global order. It was more like a club of the West. This is the argument I make in my End of American World Order book. So by persisting with the liberal internal order, you end up getting somebody like Trump, and also failures like in Afghanistan. We can change a country from some to a kind of a democracy by giving it a lot of aid and putting a lot of troops on the ground. It doesn't work. So it is scientific as well as policy as well as normative. And that is the rationale of global IR. So do not think of global IR as trying to do good. I mean, it's a good thing. It feels nice. It is actually scientifically very relevant. The theories will be much more have explanatory power, or the power to analyze and understand reality if they are drawn from a wider canvas than from a simple canvas. Now, I am looking at the time, so it's past 9 o'clock, 9 o'clock my time, so probably 3 o'clock your time. I would then try to conclude a little bit by giving you some examples of how I see a global IR approach can help you to understand, especially the history of international relations, the multiple origins of international relations better. I'll give you 2 examples, and I have many, but you have to wait for my next book to get a good sense of this. Okay. So I want to give you the first example of the Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty of 1259 BC. Now, forget about the language. Some language like peace, balance of power, sovereignty are either modern or they are based on Greco-Roman origins or Latin origins. Now, that's another problem, by the way. A lot of terms we have, like peace is from Pax, Latin. So we think as if the Romans invented peace because it is from Roman, from Latin. You will find that most of the key concepts of international relations are originally from a Latin Greek origin, and they were translated and played a very important role. Medieval French was kind of the mediator of Greco-Roman concepts to modern Europe. So then they become part of Old English and then Verbal English. And therefore, we actually think just because Pax is peace, peace was invented by Romans. I'm giving you a very blunt example, but there are many examples of how we confuse linguistic origins with substantive origins of concepts. But look at the peace treaty. Again, I'm using a modern term. 1259 BC, so mid-13th century BC, between Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II and the Hittite king Hattusis, two of the big powers of so-called the Levant Middle East region. Some people call it the world's first international peace treaty. Was written in Egyptian and Akkadian. Akkadian was the sort of lingua franca of that period at that time. And you can still see it. Last time I visited Turkey in Istanbul in 2019, I actually saw one of those tablets, part of that in Istanbul Archaeology Museum. There's one in Berlin, State Museum. So 2 of those 2 are actually my pictures from Istanbul Archaeological Museums. And there is a copy in the United Nations wall. So why is it important? Okay, so we're talking about, a lot of you are students of international law. You know that non-aggression, our collective defense, collective security is a very important principle of the modern international system and the liberal order. And look at it, this is a very rough translation. So I got it, but you can go and get a better translation. But so the great prince of Hatti shall not trespass against the land of Egypt forever, to take anything from it. And the great ruler of Egypt shall not trespass against the land of Hatti. So this is a UN principle of non-aggression. This is a principle also, in a sense, central to international law of war and peace. So very important. Then you look at the alliance part. Alliances are a little problematic. They're not always inclusive. They're always against some other country, but still, think of a world order without alliances. I mean, today or yesterday or tomorrow. So here you go. If another enemy come against the lands of Egypt and he sent to the great prince of Hatti, this is a literal translation. So sometimes you have some problems here. Come with me as a reinforcement against him. The great prince of Hatti shall come to him and slay his enemy. Same thing, it's reciprocity as well. It's not unilateral, it's reciprocity. So what do you say? Mutual self-help. If another enemy comes against the great prince of Hatti, the great ruler of Egypt shall come to him as a reinforcement to slay his enemy. Look at a mutual support. This is also interesting because in international law, non-interference is a very difficult subject. So you're not supposed to interfere in another country to help the regime against internal enemies. But countries do that all the time. I mean, the United States was supporting its own installed government against the Taliban, and the Soviet Union did that for its own puppet government during the 1980s. So intervening in internal affairs happens all the time. So even though it is supposed to be frowned upon or disallowed by the UN Charter. So here you go. If the great ruler of Egypt is enraged against servants belonging to him, like his own allies or own domestic, not servants and domestic helper, but powerful people in his own territory, subject citizens, and people with a bit of power in his her own kingdom, they commit another offense against him, and he go to slay them. The great prince of Hathi shall act with him to slay everyone against whom they shall be enraged. Now, literal translation, but the idea is that if a ruler, if the ruler of Egypt fights or faces a revolt against him by somebody in Egypt, another powerful, like a warlord, for example, the ruler of Hathi can go and help the ruler of Egypt against his internal enemy. So this is not helping against external threats. This is helping against internal threats. Same goes for between Hathi and Egypt. Hathi will do the same thing to Egypt, support each other against internal threats. Now, as I said, it's a bit of gray area here, but this is very commonly done in international relations today. And there's a bit of extradition that I will show it to you. Okay, what happens here? If a great man not providing sanctuary to each other, if a great man flee from the land of Egypt and come to Hathi, the great prince of Hathi shall not receive them, but cause them to be brought to the great ruler of Egypt. Extradite this person. Don't give sanctuary to enemies of a ruler, a regime, so to speak, in your own territory. So it's reciprocal as well. So I'm just going to ask you, why is it not considered as the foundation of peace and diplomacy? Or why do we, I can go even earlier and give you some examples of a world order building, where a bunch of great powers like the Amarna system, a few hundred years before that, between Egypt and Sam Hathi and a few other kingdoms in that area, the Amarna diplomacy. That was a great power club in some ways. And this is an example of diplomacy and treaty making, signing a treaty, a peace treaty after a war. So how much emphasis we give it to this? Why do we therefore have to look at everything from a perspective? Even the language is vividly similar to modern international law. And give you another example. This you will be familiar with, humanitarian law between Geneva Conventions and the Code of Manu. Geneva Conventions came after World War II. It embodied old principles. Article 3, look at the persons taking no active part in the hostilities, including members of armed forces who have laid down their arms, and those who are played out of action by sickness, wounds, and detention shall be treated humanely. Leave them alone, protect them. Now, Code of Manu, Indian legal code, 200 year BC, a bit of a controversy about when it was actually drafted. Some say earlier, it was created and passed on verbally. It might have been codified in 200 BC. Some people put it a bit later, 1st century, 2nd century AD, but very old anyway. And this is much more than the Code of Hammurabi because it is specifically about war and peace, or laws of humanitarian laws of principles of during combat. So it talks about the same. When the ruler fights with his foes in battle, let him not strike, who joins the palm of his hands, like surrenders in supplication, who sits down and says, I am thine, like surrender, who sleeps, who is disarmed, who looks on without taking part in the fight, who's like civilians, whose weapons are broken. One is afflicted with sorrow, one who is grievously wounded, who is in fear, who has turned to flight. Protect them. The ruler, I mean the warrior, should not fight them, should not strike them. Now, I can tell you that these principles are neither unique to India. They're also found in China and Confucian civilizations in a different way. The principle of just war. What is the right condition to go to war and what is not the right condition to go to war can be found in many other civilizations, including China, Islam, and African civilizations as well. But again, we think of the Geneva Conventions as if it was all created in one place at one time and reflecting there are European humanitarian principles that is reflected. So when you talk about responsibility to protect today, R2P, now a lot of people draw on also the principles of just war found in Christian ethics, but you will find principles of just war in every civilization. So what I'm trying to say is that these principles are developed in multiple places. There is a convergence of similarity or overlap among them. There are also differences, but there is a significant overlap, which we forget about. And they were not necessarily diffused from one place to the other. Some of them were diffused from, say, Europe to Asia or Asia to Europe, but it's very hard to establish the lines of diffusion pathway. But it is also possible that human beings, human societies, invent the same principles in different locations because they are human. And there are certain commonality. So global relations, international relations is also a human international relations. Like human rights is a right that you have just by being human. You can invent international relations just by being human. That's my principle. So to say that humanitarian law is Western or human rights, that's another subject. But where human rights came from, I don't have time to go into it, but you will find that you have protection against cruel and unjust punishment in ancient India and in ancient China. Whereas the Magna Carta was basically property rights that a bunch of lords, bunch of powerful nobles forced down the throat of King John because King John was oppressive. Fine, but the Pope invalidated the Magna Carta soon after. But we give a lot of credit to Magna Carta because of that kind of a narrative about property rights and some sort of political rights as well, where we ignore the multiple traditions we have about protection against cruel and unjust punishment. In fact, one of the edicts of King Ashoka of India talks about protection against cruel and unjust punishment. And that protection is not provided necessarily by the king. Sometimes it can be provided because it's a matter of law. It is codified. So King Ashoka of India erected edicts, stone edicts with those lines in part of the wall. And it's because many people were illiterate those days, and those are written in classical Pali language. So, but any citizen, when facing persecution from the state, which is considered cruel and unjust, can demand that I want this to be read, because they were put in the town squares so that anybody can go in and say, I want somebody to read it. So there are officials whose job was to read them out aloud. So this is the law of the land. Now you can say that, does the emperor care? Maybe doesn't. But then it is a question of legitimacy. So you will find that law can be violated, even in democracies. Or bypassed around. Trump administration did a lot of that. But law is law. Law still have a basis in universal principles. We obey law not because of fear of punishment alone. You know that. Fear of punishment is important. But it's also the legitimacy it gives to authority and governments. That's why we observe the law, because breaking the law would mean the whole society descends into chaos. So even if you have not committed any crime or not planning to commit any crime, you still obey the law because the law is there in the common interest of everybody. So if you take that kind of thing into account, you will find that actually human rights are pretty universal. And if you dissociate human rights from property rights, you will find that human rights are pretty universal. Not in maybe the same way. But by the way, the modern idea of human rights, that you have rights against the state, is very much a modern idea, 19th century. Maybe, yeah, it did come out of Europe. Ancient human rights like Magna Carta and all, they are good. Of course, the French Revolution. But when you talk about modernity, modern concept, they are new both in the West and the rest. But every civilization provided stepping stones towards that same goal. And at one point, they did converge. That's why we have human rights. Even though it is abused, we still respect it. So its legitimacy is never in doubt. Even the most, cruel and inhuman regimes do talk about the language of human rights. It's a legitimizing device, and that is legitimizing because it has a basis in multiple civilizations. Okay, so I want to end by one more thing, and this is something, again, it will resonate with those of you who know the law of the sea. So freedom of the seas is a very time-honored principle. It's the basis of free trade. It is the basis of globalization. And we give credit to freedom of seas to the Dutch legal scholar, Hugo Grotius, whose Mare Liberum was published in 1609. But that text was based on a legal brief that Grotius wrote for the Dutch East India Company, and who had a fight with the Portuguese. They basically sank a Portuguese ship. The Portuguese were unhappy. They sued each other, or they sued the Dutch, and the Dutch defended themselves. They got Grotius to write a legal brief, and Grotius claimed that the Portuguese were interfering, preventing the Dutch from trading in the Indian Ocean. This incident where the Portuguese ship was sunk was just outside of modern Singapore, which was just coming up at that time. And Grotius, of course, never went there. He was writing a legal brief for the BOC, Dutch East India Company. And he said that the sea is common to everybody, and the Portuguese were interfering, harassing Dutch shipping, therefore Dutch could not trade. So that is the argument the Dutch made against the Portuguese. And he then later on wrote it up as Mare Liberum, short book. And the subtitle is actually interesting. It does specifically refer to Indian Ocean and the Indies, so to speak. So it was developed in the context of the Indies. Now, why that Indies is important? Because the Indian Ocean had the tradition of freedom of seas for a long time. Now, modern scholars, when they look at Grotius, and this is where epistemic injustice come in, they say, well, he never really went to the Indies. Fair enough. And he got his ideas from the Romans. He got the ideas from, Roman Empire, which also provided curbed piracy and provided kind of space for free trade. But if you look at it carefully, the Romans really did create Pax Romana, did create peace in the seas, so to speak, and which allowed free trade or more of sort of active trade. But the Romans did that by conquering the entire Mediterranean. So the Mediterranean was called Mare Nostrum, our sea. Whose sea? Our sea. Now, Mare Liberum was different from Mare Clausum, the law of the sea, that the sea is closed. That was actually very dominant most of Europe. So you have European city-states, Mediterranean city-states, including Venice and Genoa, and then the British at one point called British states. They carved out the territory, the maritime territory, into parcels, as if those were an extension of the land. So if you control the land, you also control a bit of the sea. Now, Indian Ocean had no such tradition. Indian Ocean always was a Mare Liberum in practice. And in legal code too, you can look at the Code of Melaka in the 15th century, governing trade in Melaka. Anybody can trade in Melaka before the Portuguese came in just by paying tax. You are not banned because you're Chinese or Indian or Arab or African. Everybody went there. So here is what William Bernstein talks about, that as long as merchants paid customs, provided local sultans with gifts, and kept pirates at bay, the Indian Ocean was more or less a Mare Liberum. The idea that any nation might seek to control all the maritime traffic would have struck merchants and rulers alike as ludicrous. Now, can you then say Grotius got this idea from the Indian Ocean? Well, there is a debate about it, but there is no question that when he was writing this legal brief, this was about the Indies, about an incident. It was about the right of the Dutch to trade in the Indian Ocean without harassment by the Portuguese. Because the Portuguese, once they took over strategic ports like Melaka, Hormuz, they said, okay, you want to trade there, you have to pay us. It's like a protection money. You have to get a license to trade. Before, there was no such thing. So the Dutch didn't want to do this. If you don't do this, the Portuguese didn't have a big navy. but they have firepower. They can sink you, so they can harass you. So many countries just paid them just to be free of this nuisance. The Dutch refused to do that, so they created this idea: the sea is common to everybody, but that idea already existed as a practice. And Grotius may not have may not have been to the Indian Ocean, but the Dutch East India Company gave him documents about trade in the Indian Ocean. So those documents basically were, diaries and impressions and notes that were created or assembled by Europeans who traveled to the Indian Ocean. This is already in the early 17th century. And later, by that time, the Europeans were there all the time. They had studied, including the Portuguese. They've written about it. What were the traditions in the Indian Ocean? So there was no question that Grotius had ideas about what is happening in the Indian Ocean, even if he might have borrowed some ideas from the Greeks and the Romans. But another interesting thing is that this tradition in the Indian Ocean existed without a Rome being around. There was no hegemony in the Indian Ocean. No single power was dominant in the Indian Ocean. Neither the Chinese, nor the Indians, nor the Javanese, not even Melaka. They were local sort of providers of security, but they were not hegemony. There is no hegemony. The Roman Imperium, the Mediterranean had expanded trade because Rome basically ruled the Mediterranean, Mare Nostrum. The Indian Ocean had no hegemony. It developed without any hegemony. And that tradition existed for thousands of years. It was the largest trading system in the world before the Europeans came in. Atlantic did not compare, Pacific did not compare. The Indian Ocean was the largest trading system in the world, network in the world, from Africa, east coast of Africa, to east of Indonesia, going all the way to China in the north. And that functioned pretty well under customs, under traditions, and also some legal rules. You can get a text called the Maritime Codes of Melaka, which is translated into English these days. So what I'm saying is, why don't we give credit to freedom of seas and therefore globalization, and therefore, to some extent, free trade to the Indian Ocean, the merchants and seafarers of the Indian Ocean, and not only to Hugo Grotius. So this is where I stop. This is a quote from Sultan Alauddin of Goa, present-day Makassar in Indonesia, Sulawesi Island. And in the 17th century, when the Dutch, see, this is the irony, the Dutch fought the Portuguese, asked them to make the sea free for all. But they went in to impose their own monopoly. So they monopolized the spice trade. The same principle they used against the Portuguese, they basically violated it themselves. So they basically started harassing the Muslim traders of Goa who were getting spices from Maluku, and they stopped them from doing that. Said, you have to go through us. We have the monopoly. Most Europeans did that at that time. So Sultan Alauddin says, God made the land and the sea. The land he divided among men, and the sea he gave in common. It has never been heard that anyone should be forbidden to sell the seas. Now, again, to me, this is also very important. I'm not saying this is the only, this is another source of origin of freedom of seas, freedom of the and free trade and globalization. And global IR teaches out these examples, these sort of narratives from history. But also, do not forget, it's not just about being nice and inclusive. It also gives you more explanatory power and better policy responses. But most importantly, it gives legitimacy to a field that has been sadly very narrowly Eurocentric or Americanocentric. So if you bring these sort of things, you're not displacing the West. I don't want to be seen as sort of say, West did nothing, East invented everything. Now, there is a tendency of a reverse ethnocentrism in the East. I am saying that international relations is not West versus the rest, but West with the rest. And that understanding has to come if you bring in this sort of world history, global history, and try to explore the multiple global origins of the supposedly modern concepts and institutions of international relations. Okay, I'm going to stop here and I will take your questions.
It was wonderful to finish this masterclass about being the West and the rest, which was also our last masterclass in January. It was wonderful. This historical perspective of international relations, their origin, and all narratives around the West dominance in the discipline, and how, in this context, history, culture, ideas to non-Western societies plays a secondary role in the study of international relations. Thanks to finish with peace treaties and other example, like you say, there is no hierarchy. It's just we have to be really global and to give a place for everyone, and how to give like that more legitimacy to the discipline. So I know we have many questions for students from Valentina, my colleague, and also from another colleague, Ayrton, which is here. So maybe we can start with round of two questions, if it's okay for you. Juan and then Theo.
Good day, Professor. First of all, thank you for the seminar. It was very, very interesting. And my question has to do mostly with an article that you wrote about Chinese contributions to global international relations, because I think nowadays, China plays a big part of what we term as the rest. And one of the, I guess, IR theories from the so-called Chinese school that really stood out to me was the Tianxia, or all under heaven theory, which was put forward by Zhao Tinyang. And I found it really interesting because maybe the features sort of resonate to a sort of global IR model, because it sees the world as the unit of the system, and it seeks to tackle the challenges of statecraft through world building. And it also it has features such as non-exclusion, international democracy, fairness, impartiality, and it's against any sort of hegemony. So my question to you is, if this system, the Tianxia system, if you think that maybe this can become more attractive and recognized beyond China, and if it could perhaps even become a more globally recognized theory.
First of all, I would like to thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation. And my question deals with the contributions from Africa and South America to international relations. So you talked a lot about Chinese or Asian contributions, and that's something you deal with a lot in your articles. So I would like to know if maybe African or South American contributions are being ignored or overlooked because maybe they are less developed or less powerful parts of the world. Thank you.
So on the question of Chinese school of IR and the idea of Tianxia, which is all under heaven. Now, it is an important concept. Its origins goes back to 11th century BC, the Zhou dynasty, and it has been revived in last few years, few decades, or in fact, maybe past decade, in China as an alternative blueprint for the world. So I welcome that because it is pretty much that what I hope global IR will do. By the way, the guy who promotes this idea of Tianxia, his name is Zhao Tinyang. He's not an IR scholar, he's a philosopher. But it has been used increasingly by scholars in China. And in fact, many scholars outside of China as a way of critiquing this concept. So I think it is their model of universalism. Like every civilization, China has its own idea of inclusive universalism, which they think is applicable to the whole world. Just like Indians have their own idea, Islam has its own idea, or Africans. But you also have to understand that there is also a bit of politicization and distortion of this idea. Now, the Chinese history is all about Tianxia. It's also about the tributary system, which is more like a, not hegemony, but a hierarchical order. It's not as inclusive as Tianxia original concept was. And so Tianxia is all under heaven, tributary system, China at the center. So the question in TNCA is who is still the primary actor? So some people are justifiably skeptical that I think maybe sometimes they go too far, that whether TNCA is a way of legitimizing Chinese Chinese centrism, Sinocentrism in international relations. And also the fact that some of the Chinese scholars are, it's very hard in China to criticize your own government. So that also feeds into the perception that this is all a way of legitimizing Chinese Communist Party. I think the reality is much more complex. I think, again, the person who developed this concept is a philosopher, not an IR scholar. And I met him a few times, genuinely trying to present an alternative. West can be skeptical about it, but should not dismiss it. Now, it's like the liberal international order. You also think Wilsonian universalism is very inclusive, all under the sun, but under whose sun? American sun or the global set of sun, so to speak. Every concept like this should be taken with a bit of skepticism, but also not dismissed simply because it is coming from China. You will find similar concepts also in other civilizations, and try to see whether that can fit in and to visualize an alternative view of world order. So in some way, there are parallels between TNCA in China and similar universalistic concepts in the West and India, which are also inclusive. But just as other civilizations also have non-inclusive concepts of balancing of power, empire, so does China. So the moral of the story for me in global IR is that every civilization is eclectic. It has ideas about power politics and hegemony. It has ideas about inclusiveness and socialized persuasion. And we should not therefore stereotype one civilization and privilege another. We should accept only the ideas. And again, every civilization can produce alternative ideas about realism and idealism, or empire and, republic. And we try to see what are the alternative. We are all committed, in a sense, to challenging the status quo. We are maybe all committed to finding peace and stability. So far, we have only seen one dominant way of maintaining peace and stability, which is the Westphalian model, a balancing of power and then managing it somehow. But there may be, so this TNCA idea actually challenges Westphalia very directly. There are other ideas, including in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, and we can sort of bring them in and develop this alternative, not as a particularly monopoly of one civilization, but a point of reference for alternative ideas about the current world order, or to keep in mind, understand, and not forget that world order has multiple iterations, forms, and ways of protecting it and defending it. On the question of Africans and Latin America, as I said, I have a big book that covers everything from Egypt, Sumer, and then Africa. Actually, I call it the Afro-Asian origins of international relations, one of the first chapters. And I didn't just have the time to go into all of these details, but no question about, to give you some example, the idea of city-states, which is a very important form of international relations, city-states. Well, we think it was invented by the Greeks, but you'll find city-states in the Mayan civilization, going back to the similar period. You will find city-states in Indian republics of the mid-first millennium BC. So when you come to the empire of the Incas, for example, you will find that there are principles of governance, decentralization, and legitimation that are very important to understanding how an empire legitimizes itself. An empire can be also anyone, not just a formal empire, but a hegemonic nation. You will also find that the very significant contribution of the so-called New World is actually in terms of fostering the principle, some of the principal commodities of globalization, one we call the Colombian exchange, that, like without potato, Europe would still would not have overcome its famine. Many of the not just gold and silver, but all the fruits and vegetables and cash crop came from the New World. And that led to the rise of the West. That contributed to the rise of the West. That is their contribution as well, because international relations is not just about just ideas, it's also about material exchanges. And to have material exchanges and promote the well-being of societies, you need commodities. And many of these commodities came from the Americas, so to speak. And in North America, you have the Iroquois Federation, which is Iroquois of a bunch of 6 to 7 tribes in today's New York and Southern Canada, Eastern United States, formed a federation to manage the relationship in a way that many people don't understand it. These are Native Indian societies that continued from maybe 12th century AD right till the 18th century. And there is some argument that the founders of American Constitution, including Ben Franklin, might have launched an idea to how to create a federation and manage it. So those ideas are very much there. And you can go into this and see how these civilizations have contributed to modern ideas of international relations. But I did not have time to go into it. But it's by far, my previous book, the historical book, doesn't discuss it because it's not much of a history, but my forthcoming work, and there are some ideas already out there. I've got a paper on civilizations and world order somewhere in SSRN. It's a working paper, but I'm still working on this book on origins of world order. Okay.
Thank you, Professor, for your intervention. So I was wondering if you have noticed an important increase in attention to non-Western international relation theory since the publication of your book called non-Western international relation theory.
Well, it actually started a big debate. It is widely cited and it really is both accepted and criticized. So it has really had a major impact in changing the field away from Eurocentric IR to a more, broader dimension. I should tell you that it's not the only book that did that. There is post-colonialism, post-colonial theory, some of the critical theories. But post-colonialism as a theory actually did quite a bit of groundwork in challenging Eurocentrism and also challenging the dominance of Western academia in the field. But one of the problems of post-colonialism, and I said that as a friendly critique, that they really focus almost entirely on the period after the European colonialism or imperialism of the world began. They never really went back in history and looked at the kind of things I'm presenting here, like 15th century BC or 1st century AD. So they were post-colonial in the sense of focusing on the beginning of colonialism of Europe. They did not took into account alternative models of statecraft, empire, and the like. They're beginning to do that now, but still, this book, Non-Western IR Theory and these ideas, had a very major impact in getting people to engage into that kind of literature. Some people do not like the fact that we are using West and the non-West. So one of the very familiar criticism that we got that, the West and non-West are meaningless terms, and calling something non-Western, you are reifying something that doesn't exist. Well, that makes good sense, but I think this is also a little problematic in itself, because in practical discourse, people do use West and non-West. There are, until recently, every time something happened, China and the West, Russia and the West, Islam and the West. So people have no problem using West. They have a problem when you use non-West. So we therefore, first of all, we pushed back against it. I said, you do have, these are terms of convenience. They're not analytical. Yes, there is a lot of overlap between West and the rest, but in practical discourse, people do use the term, this binary, and they don't recognize the mutual learning and interaction between the West and the non-West. So we are trying to sensitize them. So having a term like this is actually creates controversy, and controversy makes you aware of what the problem is. So it served its purpose. But once it served its purpose, we moved away from that to global international relations, which doesn't have this West versus the rest. It talks about interaction, mutual learning, multiple origination of concepts. So I think right now, the term I'm focusing on, global IR has a large following now around the world, is global IR, not non-Western IR.
So first of all, thank you for your presentation. Yeah. And my question is about the difficulties encountered by non-Western theories in their diffusion around the world and in their recognition. You wrote in 2006 with Barry Buzen, who you mentioned earlier, that one of the barriers to the diffusion of non-Western theories is language. And do you think that in the age of efficient communication means and translations tools, this barrier still exists? And what are your opinions on the barriers and obstacles remaining that prevent the recognition and dissemination of non-Western theories? And do you think there are some solutions to bypass this difficulty? Thank you.
Yeah, good. I mean, one of the barriers is the language, of course. A lot of, if you go to China, for example, a lot of international relations or social sciences is in the Chinese language. So a lot of the books have to be translated, and then their ideas, many of the ideas of the Chinese don't come out unless they're written by people who know English. So we have same problem in Indonesia, which is a very large country with a large following of international relations. And again, language creates a bit of problem. Even in Latin America, the Spanish, Portuguese language is very important to the communication, but it's not English. And look at France itself. There's some fantastic ideas in France about international relations. A lot of it is in French, and it gets hidden from the view in the Anglo-American world. So language is a very powerful barrier too. So we need more translation, we need more interaction, and communication does help. Social media does help. I use social media a lot, but still we have and there is this also linguistic barrier that we think many of these concepts came from Greece and Rome because they are originally from Greek and Latin. But there are other similar concepts from India, China, which never get the light of the day because they're not in Greek and Latin. So language is a very powerful barrier. To me, the most important barrier. Another barrier is resources. Many institutions and think tanks, but universities in the global South don't have resources like libraries, for example, to subscribe to journals or books. And even internet communication is not very good in many parts of the world. So they also don't, they get left out of this conversation quite a bit. And another issue is the existing dominance, the first mover's advantage. The West has so much a kind of a jump start, so to speak, in this knowledge production race, so to speak. And so they have entrenched their position. They're refusing to give up. I'm putting it crudely, but there is a reluctance in the West not to learn from others, because they think every existing IR theory explains everything. So why do we need non-Western IR theory? Now, John Mearsheimer actually made that argument that American hegemony in international relations is benign. So we don't need other theories. The Americans are very inclusive. They bring in everybody else, and their theories apply to other parts of the world. So he doesn't see that, and that's not atypical. Then finally, there is a question of professional development. If you do non-Western IR, global IR, do you get a job? I mean, I get a lot of that question from the students. So we had a series of conversations in global IR in my university, and keep that in mind. We will be advertising this again for the fall. So we had 3 or 4 rounds of global IR conversations, bringing people from around the world. And one of the questions asked was about language, about resources, but also about students who were attending that said, how do I get a job if I do global IR as opposed to traditional? And some of the people who spoke there, like Jack Snyder, very, very prominent scholar of IR from Columbia, he said, you don't have to worry about it. We are looking for good products. So of course, there has to be certain quality. But if you bring in a lot of these examples, like what I gave you, that'll actually make the subject more interesting. rather than repeating the same narratives and same history over and over again. So actually, it will open up new avenues for research, and it will make your research more interesting if it is done with certain amount of rigor. And therefore, whether it is a global IR or traditional IR, global IR actually could get you more jobs, because it is more interesting. It enriches the field if it is done with the right amount of. There has to be certain amount of academic rigor, evidence-based analysis, but it's still very, very important. So those barriers are still there, but barriers are also going down, and I think in the future it will keep going down.
Thank you. The very last question from a colleague from Sciences Po, Ayrton Aubry. I think he's between Colombia and Dakar, and we have together a project about the colonizing international relations, but I will send you a mail just after, Mr. Professor Acharya. Ayrton.
Yes, thank you, Sonia. And thank you, Professor Acharya, for all your work. I discovered the question raised by globalizing IR with Mohamed Ayoub, but it's your work and with Barry Bison that helped me to maintain and to nurture my interest here, rather than focusing on more traditional syllabi and just being a good graduate student. So thank you. I would like actually to build on your answers to the last two questions. And also in your presentation, you mentioned that rather than increasing the gap between the West and the rest, global IR tries to bridge this gap. But then my question would be how to make sure that when we do so, we don't end up looking for manifestations of the rest, also being able to do international relations the way a proper actor would. I remember that at the beginning of my PhD, I tended to dismiss works that didn't look like the canons of international relations. And it took me months to go back to them. And I'm almost sure that I'm still doing that right now. Even though those works are written in English or in French. So how to take distance with what we still learn about mainstream IR in graduate programs on this particular topic.
So you're saying mainstream IR into what programs?
In graduate programs in general.
Graduate programs, yeah. Well, again, you have pointed to a very fundamental obstacle to broadening international relations, because I can give this lecture to you, I can give this lecture to anywhere, but when you come to training, there is a disciplining function for every discipline, so to speak. And especially if you're studying in the United States and Canada, or models based on the US, you have to pass your comprehensive exams, your PhD comprehensive exams. And that's where the disciplining comes in, because a lot of these exams are drawn from that literature of traditional literature. Now, you will look at, I don't know that you know this, the vast, almost like 80% of jobs, as professorial jobs, assistant professor in international relations, are produced by, in big major universities, are produced by only 20 universities in the US. And these are big name universities. These are the people who get hired, most likely to be hired in other universities. And those universities are very conservative, traditional universities, with some exceptions like Columbia or something. But that's why graduate students, when they came to do their PhD, they're indoctrinated from day one. For the first 2 years, they do the coursework. And the coursework, I used to teach, I still teach a course, the sort of a field seminar that everybody has to pass before you even go to write your thesis. The first 2 years, you pass this exam, then you write your thesis. By the time you write your thesis, you're already brainwashed into this existing literature. So some people did a study of these courses, how the PhD courses are formed. They found that the vast majority of them don't bother with non-Western IR theory. Most of the writers are Western, white, male. So you don't really have a lot of room for alternative voices. So the material that is being used by the trainers to educate the trainee is already biased. And if you don't pass the exam, not get trained, you're not getting a job. So what do? You reproduce yourself. The field reproduces itself. So it has this core narrative, a bunch of literatures that everybody uses. They train the people. These people then get jobs, and they do the same thing. And everybody gets scared that if you don't do that, you will not get jobs. So this is, I think, a very powerful problem. So where this will be dented is I now see like Asia, where we have a lot of resources in Asia now for good universities and good training programs. They are moving away from it. So China are moving away from it. Southeast Asia is moving away from it, except some places. India is moving away from it. I think Brazilians are moving, Turkey is moving away from it. So they are making a conscious effort to redefine the curriculum. And I think sooner or later, these ideas like global IR will make their way into the graduate curriculum. But that day is not here yet. So therefore, we now have to keep doing this sort of exercises, bringing alternative ideas, global history, multiple agency in discussions, debates, and like International Studies Association conventions. Increasingly find the theme is about global IR. Global IR has been the convention theme for 2 conventions starting with mine, but there's going to be the next one is also going to be about the same theme. So maybe not the same term. So we will need to do this in conventions, in writings, journal articles, and books. We also need more training manuals, so more textbooks. There aren't that many textbooks that actually start with global history or give a lot of space to non-Western origins of a world order. So we need to write textbooks like the way Barry and I are doing, but others are beginning to do that. But this is going to be time consuming. But I think we have made a beginning. And I see evidence of the field being more sensitive to these alternative ideas, the globality of international relations. Or maybe I'm a little more optimistic about this, but I do see evidence of that.
And it's such a passionate conversation, so I'm really happy to step in as a lawyer in this sense. And the first actually is a reflection, because I thought was really interesting to see what you were saying about international relations is actually at the core of new development also of legal studies. In comparative law, today we are more and more overcoming the classic divide, civil law, common law, trying to understand what are actually legal traditions of the world, Hindu legal tradition, Islamic legal tradition, and opening up. International law is perhaps a bit conservative, but global law is actually going in the same direction. That, if I have to push to some commonalities, I think as at the center, overcoming the state as the paradigm, both in international relationship and in legal studies. I mean, try to stop to think that the state is the unit of measure. And as we said, the state is actually a Western invention, probably the most successful legal transplant today. And my second is instead a question in this sense. So I think that the great part of your academic contribution that I find fascinating is the Westernized a certain vocabulary and concept of international relations, and seeing the global origins of many of the concepts we utilize. And in this, I saw many echoes as well, more in the legal field of Amartya Sen's work. I remember his studies about human rights, about democracy, and normatively, I love it. I love the idea to say, Western guys, you know too little about Hindu history, Hinduism, India history to understand actually that there were, much more tolerant, sensitive ways of understanding the common origins of human rights. If you, unpack the concept, that democracy itself, he says, has been somehow a violent Western appropriation, of common global values. And again, normatively, I'm really sympathetic towards that. But actually, my question is, are we not really somehow losing some explanatory potential or capacity of description of the concept? Because then this democracy that also Amartya Sen describes is more a kind of common debates, for example. So it's quite close to an idea of discursive democracy, but not on the classic democracy we know. And so my question is, wouldn't be perhaps equally interesting, if not more interesting, to try to claim a specificity of non-Western concepts that have to be included in the debate. I think, for example, about claiming that reconciliatory mechanism of solving disputes that are common to all non-Western legal traditions have many more pros than adjudicatory legal conflict resolutions. Mediation, for example, in the Chinese tradition, or to say that individual human rights needs to be counterbalanced but by collective rights, but taking them seriously, not in the way we are doing right today.
Yeah.
This is my question, right? So in
sure.
this direction.
You raise a very fundamental point, and I think I'm glad that you mentioned the term democracy here. So what I'm trying to argue is that you try to understand different types of contribution around the same concept from different parts of the world, instead of saying one particular concept came from one particular part of the world. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Amartya Sen, and I have read his argument on human rights. So he won't say that human rights was, originated in the non-West. He would still say that human rights came from West, okay? But he would say that the concept of human rights is neither Western nor non-Western before the 19th century. Mm-hmm. In the 19th century, human rights came into its own, and therefore in the West, and then it spread. But then he would say, but look at it, the other civilizations that actually had proto-human rights, elements of human rights that feed into the idea of human rights. And I give you the example of King Ashoka. He actually mentions that. And that's why I got the trigger and I look back and see, actually, he uses the language, protection against cruel and unjust punishment, which is a very important part of the human rights debate. But it was not a human rights you could claim against the emperor, although you could demand a hearing. So you could demand that I want to read the law. So I am illiterate. So you tell me what the law is in front of everybody else. So you are shaming the ruler if they are abusing your right, or protection against cruel and unjust punishment. So we should bring that in. But what happens in the West is that if you have this kind of fragments, little bit of this, little bit of that, they ignore that. But if it comes from Greece and Rome, that's okay. I know that there may be people from Greece here. And democracy is a classic example. Democracy is supposed to come from Greece, okay, Athens. So direct democracy. But do you also know that it was limited to, I have counted in one state that called city-state in Attica around Athens, only 13% of the population actually had right to vote. Participate, because the citizens were only, women could not vote, slaves could not vote, foreigners could not be of course participate. So 13% of a population actually had the right to make decisions. And many of them were, common people, but also a privileged position. But more importantly, and I was quite shocked when I actually read in the literature on Greece, ancient Greece. Greeks had no sense of individual liberty. Their liberty, when people talk about Greek defining liberty, it was liberty of the polis, liberty of the city-state, and make it more glorious, ever more powerful, rather than defending. In fact, in Greece, you had no individual liberty. The liberty of the individual are subjugated to the liberty of the state. Many people don't get that because they think the term democracy came from Greece. Now, there is no question that Greeks had a lot to do with the invention of democracy, but it was not a perfect democracy. It was a limited democracy. But we say Greeks invented democracy. Now, if you have the same concept like India about republic or protection against cruel and unjust punishment, people will say, oh, the Indian concept of human rights was different. It's nothing like the modern concept of human rights. I would say the same thing. The Greek concept of democracy is nothing like the modern concept of democracy because it was not, just think of democracy without individual rights. In the modern sense. So that's the problem. We have double standards. If something came out of the ancient Greece and Rome, even if it's not similar to what we have today, we still give them credit. If something came out of India and China and Islam and doesn't look the same as we have modern concepts, we just ignore it. So just one example. So what do you do about this? I mean, I think you just have to accept the fact that, we're not going back into history, just to say that concepts have multiple global origins doesn't mean they're the same concepts. Concepts evolve over a period of time. A lot of the ideas and institutions we have are kind of blended through history and maybe developed independently by different civilizations and come together in the 19th, 20th century. And that is a contribution of Europeans because they really, in essence, imperial, but they kind of unified the world a little bit more than any previous civilization in a coercive way, but they still did that. And that sort of brought in a lot of ideas together. And now in the post-imperial stage, we are getting to see the result. Those civilizations like China and India and Islam that are Africa or the pre-Columbian America, which has sort of disappeared, they feel neglected because they don't find their voices in the contemporary discourse. It's all written with reference to European or Western thinkers. So if we can remove that, we can bring in these ideas, even not saying that, no civilization invented something that exists today in that same form, but they all got modified and blended together. And therefore, we do have a global international relations that reflects that sort of blending. Then if we come to accept it, if you then go back to history and introduce that literature, that will be good. So I give you the example of the Law of the Sea. I'm not saying that Grotius is irrelevant, but the thing is we give a lot of credit to his Mare Liberum when he was actually defending a monopolist imperialist company, the Dutch East India Company. So why don't we think about that? The guy was actually defending a monopolist against a tradition of free trade that existed in the Indian Ocean. So why don't we say, okay, Grotius is one point of origin, but another point of in text and writing, another point of origin is the Sultan of Makassar or the Indian Ocean tradition. And if you bring that in, even if neither of them were perfect in terms of modern law of the sea, neither of them are perfect, but they do give us ideas of where this came from. Same goes for democracy, same goes for human rights, same goes for almost every concept. They're not perfectly the same as they had before. They have evolved, and some civilizations have developed them in a certain way. But now in the global civilization, not global in singular civilization, but in the multi-civilizational world, we need to acknowledge different parts of the same concept might have come from different parts of the world.
I think it was wonderful, and it's a wonderful finishing for this conference. I would just keep in mind the West with the rest. Maybe it will be the thematica for our next masterclass, Valentina. Thank you to everybody. Thank you, our students. Thank you, Naimi, for everything. Thank you, Valentina, Ioannis. And I keep the floor to Valentina and our dean for the conclusion of this masterclass.
Okay, thank you very much. And I hope to stay in touch. And maybe I'll see you in person one of these days.
We hope
yes,
so.
I hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor.